Imagine a world where power was as fragile as glass, where the crown itself could be won or lost in a matter of days, and where behind every great man stood a woman whose influence rarely made the official records. The Tudor court was a stage of ambition, betrayal, and survival, and few families played the game of power as daringly as the Dudleys. Known for bold gambles and near-catastrophic downfalls, the Dudleys walked a tightrope between greatness and ruin. But within this dynasty of risk-takers, there was one figure who never sought the spotlight, yet whose quiet maneuvers altered the course of English history. Her name was Anne, and she was far more than a wife or mother. She was the hidden architect who kept her family's fortunes alive through diplomacy, resilience, and remarkable foresight. While history books often celebrate kings, queens, and soldiers, Anne's story reminds us that power does not always come from the throne or the battlefield. Sometimes it comes from subtle conversations, from relationships built patiently, and from the ability to keep calm when everything else is falling apart. Anne's influence stretched beyond her immediate family, shaping the future of the Dudleys and even touching the reign of Elizabeth herself. She was in many ways the unsung queen-maker, the uncrowned strategist who proved that influence can be every bit as powerful as authority. Welcome to Words of Time. In this video, we will dive into the extraordinary story of Anne Dudley, the woman who quietly redefined her family's destiny and secured their place in Tudor history. Stay with us as we uncover how her choices and her strength turned moments of crisis into opportunities, and how she became the true, though unacknowledged, architect of a Tudor powerhouse. Imagine a family playing chess with the crown itself. That was the Dudleys, a house whose ambitions and maneuvers placed them on the most perilous board of Tudor politics. In a world where the smallest misstep could bring ruin and the sharpest calculation could elevate one to unimaginable heights, the Dudleys became both feared and admired. Their story is not one of quiet survival, but of relentless pursuit of prominence, wealth, and influence in a time when the throne of England was never entirely secure. To understand the Dudleys is to step into a time of constant upheaval, where loyalty was questioned daily, where fortunes shifted in the blink of an eye, and where ambition could be both the making and the unmaking of a family. The Tudors themselves were a dynasty born of uncertainty. Henry VII had won his crown through battle, not blood, and that origin meant the throne remained vulnerable. The nobles surrounding the monarchy sought advantage, and families with the will to gamble on the fortunes of a shifting realm could find themselves either elevated into royal favor or destroyed by a single accusation of treason. In this world, the Dudleys emerged as a family unafraid of risk. They were not the oldest of noble houses. They lacked the centuries of pedigree that gave others a claim to effortless respect. Instead, they built their standing through service, loyalty when it suited them, and above all a readiness to seize opportunities others hesitated to grasp. It was this boldness that made them both dangerous and indispensable. At first, the Dudleys were not among the most powerful. They were neither close kin to the Tudors nor holders of vast estates that secured independence from the crown. Their position was fragile, yet they did not accept fragility as fate. They turned instead to court service, to martial skill, and to the careful art of aligning with the right patron at the right moment. Every generation of the family seemed to carry a hunger to climb higher than the last, and this hunger shaped their legacy. They were rarely content with safety. What they wanted was power, the kind that came from proximity to the monarch and the ability to sway policy, appointments, and even the succession itself. The Tudor era was uniquely suited to families like the Dudleys. Henry VIII, with his shifting passions, his endless struggles for heirs, and his ruthless treatment of both friends and enemies, opened cracks in the old order. Nobles rose and fell not only on the field of battle, but also in the corridors of court. One day, a man might dine with the king and shape his decisions. The next, he might be condemned as a traitor. To thrive in such an environment required audacity, cunning, and no small amount of luck. The Dudleys possessed all three, though luck was never theirs to command for long. What set the Dudleys apart was their refusal to settle. Where others might cling to whatever small station they had, the Dudleys looked ever upward. They saw possibility in every turn of the crown's fortunes. When Henry VIII discarded one wife and married another, they found a way to link themselves to the change. When factions at court fought for dominance, they picked sides boldly, knowing that a victory would bring rewards and a loss could cost them everything. This daring spirit won them both advancement and enemies, for few families could rise so quickly without inspiring suspicion and resentment. Their ambition was like a fire, bright and powerful, but always threatening to consume them. It is easy to see the Dudleys as opportunists, and in many ways they were. But they also understood the nature of Tudor rule better than most. They recognized that the monarchy was both supreme and fragile. Kings and queens held absolute power, but their authority was only secure as long as the nobility and the people supported them. The Dudleys exploited this tension with skill. They flattered when flattery worked, they fought when fighting was needed, and they never forgot that survival meant adapting to every new twist in fortune. This made them indispensable allies at times and dangerous rivals at others. They walked a narrow line between service and self-interest, and though they sometimes stumbled, they never stopped striving. The family's initial standing gave them enough to dream, but not enough to rest. They had titles, lands, and connections, but nothing that ensured lasting security. Each generation was forced to fight anew for relevance, which may explain why ambition became their defining trait. In an age when bloodlines often dictated destiny, the Dudleys refused to let their origins limit them. They embraced the uncertainty of the Tudor court as an opportunity rather than a threat. This boldness carried them into positions of authority that might otherwise have been forever beyond their reach. As the Tudor century unfolded, the Dudleys rose higher than ever seemed possible. They would hold the ear of monarchs, command armies, and even, for a brief moment, play the most dangerous hand of all by placing their own kin on the throne. Yet with every ascent came peril, for power in Tudor England was never stable. Each reward carried risks, each alliance had the potential to unravel, and each triumph placed a target on their backs. The Dudleys lived by the sword of ambition, and they knew full well that it might one day cut them down. Their story is filled with dramatic turns. They were not simply courtiers, but kingmakers and plotters, figures whose choices shaped the fate of the realm. They learned to wield charm, force, and strategy in equal measure. They could be ruthless, but they were also visionaries, always looking beyond the present moment to the possibilities of the future. Their influence reached not only into the crown's immediate circle, but also into the wider political and religious conflicts of the day. The Dudleys were not bystanders to history. They were actors who sought to direct it. In the end, every great family must be measured not only by the men who led it, but also by the women who carried its name and ambitions forward. The Dudleys were no exception. Among them was Anne, a figure who would redefine their influence in ways even her male relatives could not. She would navigate the treacherous waters of court with intelligence, resilience, and a vision of her own. Where the men of her family often relied on bold strokes and daring risks, and embodied a quieter, but no less formidable strength. She proved that in a world ruled by kings and queens, a woman could wield power just as effectively, though often by subtler means. Anne's arrival in the story of the Dudleys marked a turning point. She was not content to remain a passive observer of her family's fortunes. Instead, she became a force who shaped them, extending the Dudley reach in ways that were lasting and profound. Through her, the family's influence took on new dimensions, proving that ambition was not confined to the men who bore the Dudley name, and showed that power could be redefined, not only seized but also transformed. Her role reminds us that history is never the work of one gender alone, and that the legacy of families like the Dudleys was built as much by the women within them as by the men who bore their titles. The Dudleys, then, were not just a family of opportunists climbing the Tudor ladder. They were architects of their own destiny, willing to gamble everything for the chance of greatness. They thrived in a world of shifting sands, where power was fleeting and danger was constant, because they believed that fortune favored those bold enough to seize it. Their tale is one of both triumph and tragedy, of daring gambits and costly miscalculations, and at its heart stands Anne, ready to redefine not only her family's place in history, but also the very meaning of influence in the Tudor court. Anne's arrival within the Dudley story was no accident of chance. She stepped into a family already marked by ambition, but she carried her own capacity for strategy and self-preservation that made her more than simply a passive participant in the shifting fortunes of her kin. Her early years in the Tudor court were shaped by decisions that revealed both her sharp mind and her willingness to use the tools available to her as a woman in a world dominated by men. She was not born into the Dudleys but married into them, and that marriage was one of her first great moves in a game of survival and influence that would define her life. For women of noble standing during the Tudor century, marriage was rarely about love. It was about alliance, protection, and opportunity, and understood this well. She entered her marriage not as a girl swept away by romance, but as a figure who recognized the value such a union could bring to herself and her new family. The Dudleys, still climbing their way through the ranks of Tudor politics, required connections that could anchor their position at court, and brought with her a blend of lineage, reputation, and networks that immediately strengthened their standing. Her presence within the Dudley orbit was not simply symbolic. It was practical, a calculated step that widened their reach and provided new entry points into the circles that mattered. From the moment the vows were exchanged, the marriage offered more than companionship. It was a bridge between families, a tie that could be drawn upon when favors were needed or when rivals sought to undermine Dudley ambitions. In an age when every noble house was engaged in a constant balancing act of loyalty and rivalry, such alliances were lifelines. Anne's marriage allowed the Dudleys to position themselves more securely, giving them access to opportunities that might otherwise have been closed. It provided legitimacy, a signal to others that the Dudleys were not a passing force but a family to be reckoned with, bound into the wider fabric of Tudor power through deliberate bonds. Yet to see Anne only through the lens of marriage would be to underestimate her. Many noble women of her time were married off into unions that defined their existence, but Anne was not content to let her role end at the altar. Almost immediately after her marriage, she began the careful work of shaping her own space within the court. This was not done through loud declarations or bold gestures. Instead, she practiced the subtle arts that women of ambition had to master, cultivating friendships, exchanging favors, and knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, and moved with care among the wives, daughters, and sisters of those who held the king's attention. These women, often overlooked by chroniclers who focused on battles and parliaments, were in fact vital nodes of power. They passed messages, carried influence, and offered quiet counsel that shaped the decisions of their powerful husbands, fathers, and brothers, and understood that to build her own influence, she needed to stand within this circle and become trusted within it. Her early social maneuvers reflect a mind keenly aware that relationships were currency in Tudor England. She listened more than she spoke, learning the unspoken rules of the court and noting who held grudges, who could be swayed with praise, and who demanded respect. She gave small gifts when they would be remembered, offered sympathetic ears when others needed to unburden themselves, and ensured that her presence was neither threatening nor forgettable. It was a delicate balance to maintain, but it allowed her to weave a network of connections that could be relied upon when storms gathered over the Dudley name. Anne's social skill was matched by her ability to read situations with clarity. While the Dudley men often sought advancement through bold risks, she leaned on patience and foresight. She did not rush into schemes but waited, assessing where her efforts would be most effective. This quiet strength made her more than just a wife lending support from the background. It made her a strategist in her own right, someone who could guide her family's fortunes with the kind of careful hand that avoided unnecessary danger while still ensuring progress. There were moments early in her marriage when this strength revealed itself most clearly. When disputes arose among noble families, Anne knew how to calm tempers without surrendering ground. When whispers of treason or disloyalty spread through the corridors of power, she positioned herself as a figure above suspicion, someone whose loyalty to crown and kin was beyond question. This was not accidental but deliberate. She built an image of dependability and discretion, which in turn made others more willing to confide in her and to align with her interests. The benefits of this approach were not immediate riches or titles, but something far more valuable: trust. In a court where betrayal was commonplace and suspicion could destroy reputations overnight, trust was the rarest of commodities, and gathered it carefully, ensuring that when the Dudleys faced challenges, she could draw upon her alliances not only through her husband's standing, but through her own cultivated friendships. These bonds gave her leverage and allowed her to influence outcomes quietly, often without her name ever appearing in official records. Her intelligence was not the kind displayed in books or speeches, but in observation, memory, and judgment. She had the ability to notice what others missed, to recall the smallest detail of a conversation months later, and to understand how those details could shift relationships or decisions. This made her invaluable to her family, though much of her work was hidden behind the scenes. To the outside world, she might have appeared as a loyal consort. Within her own circle, however, she was recognized as someone who could be relied upon to manage delicate situations with poise. Anne's early moves show that she was far more than a silent figure in a marriage alliance. She was a woman who understood her environment, adapted to it, and then used it to her advantage. She played the long game, knowing that influence gained gradually and carefully would endure longer than power seized in haste. This foresight distinguished her from many around her and ensured that she would not simply ride upon the Dudley ambition, but contribute to shaping it in ways that lasted. She may not have commanded armies or sat in councils, but commanded something just as vital: the respect and confidence of those who moved within the shadows of Tudor politics. Her strength lay in the fact that she did not need to be the loudest voice in the room. She needed only to be the voice that others trusted when the moment came. This quiet power would become a cornerstone of the Dudley legacy, proving that influence is not always measured in titles or lands, but in the subtle art of guiding others toward the outcomes one desires. In these first years of her marriage, Anne revealed who she was: not a passive partner, but a strategist, a connector, and a woman of intelligence whose role in the Dudley story would be every bit as significant as that of her male counterparts. She laid foundations that would carry her family forward, and in doing so, she ensured that her name would not fade into obscurity, but instead stand as a testament to what a determined and perceptive woman could achieve in one of the most dangerous courts England had ever known. Anne's marriage had already begun to pay dividends for the Dudley cause, but her true genius was revealed in the ways she moved beyond the expected boundaries of her station. She was no ordinary wife, content with the modest role of consort and mother. She was an architect of ambition, constructing a web of influence with remarkable foresight. The Dudleys had already proven themselves daring in the public stage of Tudor politics, but their audacity often left them vulnerable. What Anne provided was balance, subtlety, and the ability to maneuver in spaces where open aggression would have brought destruction. Her masterstrokes were not the dramatic declarations chroniclers loved to record, but the quieter, calculated interventions that changed outcomes in ways her rivals rarely saw until it was too late. The first measure of her influence can be found in her ability to shape political decisions through personal relationships. Tudor politics was never confined to councils and parliaments. It thrived in corridors, gardens, chambers, and above all in the private conversations where trust and persuasion held greater sway than statutes. Anne recognized this and made herself indispensable in such settings. She cultivated a reputation for wisdom beyond her years, a quality that drew confidences from those at court who needed a sympathetic ear. Men and women alike found themselves sharing fears, plans, and ambitions with her, believing that she posed no threat. Yet every word she gathered was a piece in a larger puzzle, a resource she could call upon when her family required advantage. A striking example lies in how she handled the shifting allegiances surrounding questions of succession. The Tudors were plagued by uncertainty in this matter from the beginning of Henry VIII's reign. The legitimacy of heirs, the rival claims of bloodlines, and the religious disputes that further complicated loyalties made succession one of the most perilous issues of the age. And, while never the one to issue proclamations or lead debates, nonetheless influenced discussions behind the scenes. She knew how to position the Dudleys as indispensable allies to whichever side appeared most likely to prevail. At times this meant tempering the boldness of her husband and brothers-in-law, urging them to patience when a reckless move could expose them. At other times, it meant whispering the right encouragement to those whose decisions could tilt the balance in favor of her kin. Anne's influence was also evident in the way she managed the Dudley reputation during periods of danger. Ambition brought rewards, but it also bred resentment. Rivals at court were eager to accuse the Dudleys of treachery, overreach, or arrogance. A single misstep could lead to arrest or worse, and countered this not by meeting slander with defiance, but by working quietly to soften hostility. She reminded others of shared bonds, called upon debts of gratitude, and employed gestures of loyalty that made even enemies pause. When men of power considered whether to move against her family, they often found themselves restrained by the knowledge that Anne was connected to their wives, sisters, or daughters through bonds of friendship and mutual respect. These invisible threads were her armor, shielding the Dudleys when their boldness left them exposed. One cannot overlook the role of court intrigue in her strategies. The Tudor court was a nest of rumor, and reputations could be built or destroyed by whispers, and proved adept at controlling such currents. She never allowed herself to become the obvious source of gossip, but she knew how to set narratives in motion that favored her family. A kind word about a rival at the right moment could dull suspicion. A subtle hint of another's weakness, delivered in apparent confidence, could erode trust in an adversary. She turned the court's hunger for stories into a weapon, directing it not with blunt force but with the precision of a surgeon's hand. This mastery extended to her ability to identify where loyalty was strongest and where it was weakest. She did not waste effort trying to win over those who would never side with the Dudleys. Instead, she invested her energy in those who could be swayed. Sometimes these were minor figures, overlooked by others, but saw their potential as conduits of influence. A servant close to a powerful lady, a secretary trusted with private letters, a relative who might repeat a conversation at a family supper. Such people became part of her network. Through them, she could plant ideas or gather intelligence, ensuring that the Dudleys were never blindsided by events. Anne's most remarkable stroke came during the height of the Dudley ascent, when her family attempted the boldest gamble of all, positioning themselves at the center of the succession crisis after the death of Edward. This was a moment of immense risk, when ambition could either deliver the crown itself into their grasp or drag them to ruin. While the men of her family schemed openly and worked in parallel, ensuring that their bid did not collapse before it began, she strengthened ties with those who doubted but might be persuaded, appealing to their self-interest rather than pressing them with threats. She soothed anxieties about legitimacy, framing the Dudley position as one that protected stability rather than endangered it. She understood that the language of duty and order would resonate more than the naked hunger for power. Although the attempt to crown Lady Jane Grey ultimately failed, one must not overlook how close it came to success and how much of that was owed to Anne's behind-the-scenes maneuvers. Without her ability to soften resistance and align wavering factions, the Dudleys might never have reached the point of even placing a crown upon Jane's head. That their enemies had to fight so fiercely to reverse the act speaks volumes about how effectively Anne had prepared the ground. The ripple effect of her actions was profound. Even in defeat, the Dudleys were remembered as kingmakers, a status that underscored just how deeply their influence had penetrated the fabric of Tudor power. Her contributions were not limited to matters of succession, and also shaped decisions in matters of policy and patronage. She recognized that controlling appointments to key offices could secure long-term advantages for her family, while her male relatives lobbied openly for such positions and worked quietly to ensure that allies were advanced and rivals excluded. A recommendation here, a warning there, a word of caution to a wife who then advised her husband. These small interventions accumulated until the Dudleys found themselves surrounded by men and women who owed them favor. This environment magnified their reach, making them seem larger and more unassailable than they truly were. The ripple effects of Anne's work extended beyond her immediate generation. She established patterns of influence that her children and grandchildren would inherit. By teaching them the value of patience, subtlety, and connection, she ensured that the Dudley legacy was not entirely dependent on bold gambles. She gave them tools for survival that could be employed even when fortune turned against them. Her legacy was not merely in the dramatic rise of her family to the heights of power, but in the strategies she left behind that allowed them to endure when others might have vanished altogether. It is important to recognize that Anne's strength lay not in defiance of her gendered role, but in her ability to use it as cover. Men underestimated her, assuming that as a wife and mother she posed little threat. She allowed them this illusion while building influence in spaces they could not see. In doing so, she turned the limitations of her station into opportunities. By seeming harmless, she gained access to confidences. By appearing modest, she avoided suspicion. By cultivating loyalty among women, she tapped into a network that her male rivals often dismissed as irrelevant. These strategies were not only effective, but revolutionary in their quiet way, showing that power in Tudor England could be wielded by those who never held a sword or signed a proclamation. Anne's masterstrokes were not accidents of circumstance, but deliberate acts of strategy. They reveal a mind capable of seeing the long arc of events, of understanding how today's gesture might yield tomorrow's triumph. She was the architect of a vision that made the Dudleys more than just ambitious men scrambling for advantage. She gave their ambition structure, coherence, and sustainability. Through her influence, the Dudleys reached a level of power that few families of their origins could ever have dreamed of attaining. The story of Anne's quiet brilliance underscores a truth often missed in accounts of Tudor politics: that power is not always visible. The grand gestures and bold proclamations are only the surface. Beneath them lie the subtle hands, the guiding voices, the carefully placed words that shape the course of nations. And Dudley was such a hand, such a voice, and her work made possible both the heights her family achieved and the legacy they carried forward long after her own time had passed. The Dudley name had never been free from danger, and as the family rose higher in Tudor politics, the crises they faced became more frequent and more severe. Ambition always carried risk, and when the Dudleys reached for crowns and thrones, the risk was nothing less than annihilation. The failed bid to place Lady Jane Grey upon the throne had been one of the most daring and perilous moves in their history, and the fallout left them exposed in ways they had not fully anticipated. Men of the family were imprisoned, their lands and titles stripped, and their very lives in question. Rivals circled like hawks, eager to see the Dudley name extinguished once and for all. Yet in this crucible of crisis, it was Anne who displayed a strength and adaptability that kept the family from disappearing entirely. She may not have wielded armies or issued proclamations, but her role was no less decisive. She became the anchor when everything else seemed to be collapsing, and through her resilience the Dudleys survived the storm. In the wake of Jane Grey's brief reign, the family was plunged into turmoil. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who had been the architect of the plan, was executed. Other male members faced imprisonment or disgrace. The family's wealth, carefully built over years of calculation and service, was seized by the crown. At such a moment, most noble houses would have collapsed, reduced to ruin by the loss of patriarchs and the stripping away of status. But Anne refused to allow her family to dissolve into obscurity. She knew that defeat was not the end so long as there remained even a sliver of opportunity to rebuild. Her first act of survival was to protect those left behind. In times of upheaval, widows and children were often left vulnerable, their fates tied to the mercy of the monarch or the cruelty of enemies, and ensured that her household remained intact, shielding her children from the worst consequences of the disaster. She called upon the network of alliances she had so carefully cultivated in earlier years, appealing to friends, in-laws, and sympathizers who were willing to intervene on behalf of her family. Where others might have recoiled from association with the disgraced Dudleys, Anne's years of subtle diplomacy paid off. People remembered her loyalty, her discretion, and her kindness. That goodwill, earned long before the crisis, became the lifeline that sustained her through it. She also understood the importance of appearances. In Tudor England, perception often mattered as much as reality. A family that seemed broken could be treated as broken, and one that projected dignity could invite restoration. And carried herself with composure, refusing to be seen as a woman undone by misfortune. Even in moments of grief, she presented a face of resilience, reminding both friend and foe that the Dudleys were down but not finished. This image mattered enormously. It prevented rivals from fully erasing her family and kept alive the possibility of return to favor. Anne's adaptability was most visible in her dealings with the new Queen Mary Tudor. Mary had every reason to hate the Dudleys, for they had attempted to bar her from the throne and replace her with Jane Grey. Many expected that she would exact vengeance not only on the men who had opposed her, but also on their families. Yet Anne found ways to soften that fury. She did not challenge Mary openly, for such defiance would have been fatal. Instead, she appealed to the Queen's sense of mercy, framing her family not as traitors, but as victims of circumstance. She emphasized loyalty where she could, downplayed the role of her household in the scheme, and sought to present herself as a woman of faith and humility. In doing so, she made it harder for Mary to justify further bloodshed against her. There were also practical maneuvers, and carefully petitioned for the release of certain family members, pressing for clemency where others might have despaired. She reminded those in power of debts owed, of kinship ties, and of the dangers of excessive retribution. Every small victory mattered, for each life spared was another chance for the Dudleys to rebuild. Through her persistence, she managed to save lives that might otherwise have been lost to the axe or the noose. These were not dramatic triumphs, but in the desperate circumstances of the time, they were extraordinary successes. Anne's resilience was not limited to preserving what remained. She also began to rebuild, laying groundwork for the family's eventual return to prominence. She understood that the winds of Tudor politics shifted quickly, and that today's queen could be replaced by tomorrow's rival. By maintaining her networks and continuing to nurture alliances, she ensured that the Dudleys would not be permanently excluded. Her ability to think beyond the immediate disaster, to imagine a future where her family could again hold influence, was itself a remarkable act of vision. One must also consider the emotional strength this required. To endure the loss of kin, the confiscation of wealth, and the threat of complete ruin, while still projecting stability and resolve, demanded a resilience that few could muster. Many women in her position would have retreated into mourning or exile, and instead chose to fight, though she fought with tools different from those her male relatives had used. Where they relied on bold gambles and military might, she relied on patience, persuasion, and persistence. Her battlefield was the court, the home, and the quiet conversations that shaped decisions. Her actions in this crisis had long-reaching consequences. By preventing total ruin, she ensured that the Dudley name endured into the reign of Elizabeth, where her descendants would again find favor. The survival of Robert Dudley, who would become Elizabeth's closest companion, was due in no small part to Anne's interventions and her ability to keep her family intact during the darkest hours. Without her resilience, the Dudleys might have been remembered only as a cautionary tale of overreach. Instead, they became central players in one of the most celebrated reigns in English history. The connection between her actions and the dynasty's stability cannot be overstated. She proved that ambition could survive even in the ashes of failure, provided there was someone willing to nurture it patiently until conditions improved. The Dudley's story is not one of uninterrupted triumph, but of remarkable recoveries from near-total disaster. At the heart of that survival stood Anne, whose adaptability in crisis gave her family a second life. Her role during this period illuminates the broader truth of Tudor politics, that survival was often as important as victory. The crown could change hands, policies could shift, fortunes could rise and fall overnight. What mattered most was the ability to endure, to wait out the storm, and to re-emerge when the time was right. And exemplified this quality. She demonstrated that resilience was not passive endurance but active navigation, a constant effort to steer through danger while keeping the vessel of her family intact. The crucible of crisis revealed her character more clearly than any other moment. It showed that her influence was not limited to the comfortable years of courtly intrigue, but extended into the darkest moments of peril. It revealed her as both protector and strategist, as someone who could transform disaster into a foundation for renewal. And it confirmed that her quiet strength was not merely an ornament to the Dudley story, but its very backbone, the force that allowed ambition to survive when all else had failed. Anne's presence within the Dudley story cannot be dismissed as secondary, nor can it be reduced to the role of a dutiful consort standing silently behind the ambitions of her husband or the daring of her sons. She was, in truth, the quiet force without which the Dudley name might never have survived its early crises, much less risen to the dizzying heights of favor and influence that define their place in Tudor history. When we reflect on the span of her life, her actions, and the ripples that extended outward from her choices, it becomes clear that she was more than simply a participant in events. She was a maker of fortunes, a shield in times of calamity, and an architect of ambition whose legacy remains embedded in the fabric of her family's power. Her contribution to the Dudley dynasty was multifaceted. At the most basic level, she provided stability. Ambition often makes men reckless, and the Dudley men were no exception. Their boldness brought them within reach of crowns, but it also placed them in the path of danger again and again. What Anne offered was not caution that stifled their drive, but balance that kept them from complete ruin when schemes faltered. In times of prosperity, she ensured that alliances were nurtured and reputations managed so that envy did not overwhelm them. In times of crisis, she preserved what could be saved, whether through appeals for mercy, careful petitions, or the cultivation of goodwill among allies. This preservation proved decisive, for it meant that even after failure the Dudleys were not erased, but rather remained ready to rise once the political climate shifted in their favor. Beyond preservation, Anne's role as a strategist shaped the Dudley ascent. She understood better than most that power in Tudor England was never held securely by force alone. It depended on relationships, on reputation, on the subtle agreements made in private chambers and whispered in corridors. She excelled at weaving these threads together, creating a fabric of influence that extended in every direction. Where her male relatives might see only the blunt tools of office or marriage, and perceive the more delicate levers of loyalty and trust. By using these levers, she guided outcomes in ways that were often invisible, yet profoundly effective. Her success lay not in dramatic gestures, but in steady, cumulative influence that positioned her family advantageously time after time, and also understood the power of image. In a world where perception could determine survival, she cultivated a persona that combined dignity, modesty, and resilience. This image made her both respected and underestimated, a combination that allowed her to maneuver without arousing suspicion. When the Dudleys were at risk of being branded as arrogant usurpers, Anne's presence softened their reputation, reminding others that this was also a family bound by loyalty and guided by faith. Her ability to project calm in moments of turmoil gave her kin a strength that few others enjoyed. The legacy of her actions is most clearly seen in the trajectory of her children, particularly Robert Dudley. Robert's survival and eventual rise to become the favored companion of Elizabeth was not merely a matter of personal charm or chance. It was made possible by Anne's tireless work in the aftermath of catastrophe, when she shielded her family from destruction under Queen Mary. Without her persistence in those dark years, Robert might never have lived to find himself at Elizabeth's side, and the Dudley name might never have become synonymous with the splendor of that court. Her influence thus extended beyond her own lifetime, shaping the path that her descendants would tread. But Anne's reach cannot be measured only in terms of her family. Her influence spilled outward into the broader historical landscape. By preserving the Dudleys and ensuring their continued relevance, she indirectly shaped the course of Elizabeth's reign. Robert Dudley's presence as Elizabeth's trusted favorite had immense consequences for English politics, diplomacy, and even the culture of the court. Decisions about war, marriage, and governance were all colored by Robert's influence, and by extension, by the survival Anne had fought to secure. In this sense, her hand can be traced not only in the fortunes of her own household, but in the destiny of the nation itself. Consider, too, the example she set for women of her time. Tudor England was not a place that offered women many official avenues for power. Yet Anne demonstrated how influence could be exercised in less visible but equally decisive ways. She showed that by cultivating networks, managing reputations, and navigating crises with composure, a woman could become as central to dynastic survival as any general or counselor. Her story is a reminder that the shaping of history was not confined to parliaments or battlefields, but also occurred in drawing rooms, at dinner tables, and in the private conversations that turned the tide of events. Anne's legacy, therefore, challenges us to reconsider what it means to wield power. She wore no crown, commanded no armies, and signed no proclamations, yet she was instrumental in making and preserving a dynasty that touched the throne itself. Her life illustrates the truth that power often lies not in titles, but in the capacity to influence outcomes, to preserve in times of peril, and to envision a future beyond immediate disaster. She embodied resilience, foresight, and subtlety, qualities without which the Dudleys might have been extinguished long before Elizabeth's golden age. Was Anne the true, albeit uncrowned, architect of a Tudor powerhouse? The evidence suggests that she was. Without her, the Dudleys might have been remembered as little more than reckless adventurers who gambled too boldly and paid with their lives. With her, they became enduring figures whose influence spanned generations, whose reach touched the throne, and whose name became woven into the fabric of Tudor history, and did not need a crown to shape her legacy. She achieved something rarer: the ability to alter the fate of her family, and by extension, her country, without ever appearing to hold power directly. Her life is best understood as a paradox. She was both visible and invisible, central yet often overlooked, modest in appearance yet monumental in impact. History has remembered the Dudley men for their daring, their gambles, and their triumphs and failures. But behind their story stands Anne, steady and unyielding, guiding with a hand so sure that it saved them from ruin more than once. Her masterstrokes of strategy, her resilience in crisis, and her lasting influence across generations mark her not just as a supporter of ambition, but as its very architect. She was, in every sense, the unsung queen-maker of her age.